Hey everyone, this is lesson 8, and we're going to be taking a look at Peter Singer's article, Are All Animals Equal? Now, this ties in really nicely to what I was talking about or at least what the Crash Course video was talking about back in lesson 7, where it was kind of talking about personhood and by what criteria do we consider something a person, and could a machine ever meet that standard? Well, Peter Singer is going to extend this line of argumentation and see if it applies to animals too, right? Do we care about animals in the same way that we care about humans, and should we? The machine comparison is also pretty relevant here because even surprisingly recently, thinkers like Rene Descartes and other great thinkers in philosophy thought that animals were basically just biological machines, right? If you kicked an animal, its pain response was no different than if you, hit a snooze button on an alarm clock, right, and it stops doing something, right? It was a purely mechanical type of response. But we have learned a lot about animals, and that's not a common attitude anymore. But to really go deeper into this philosophical argument, we need to, again, understand the conclusion and the premises. What's the argument Peter Singer is giving us in response to this very provocative title that he's given us, that all animals are equal, which on its face sounds kind of absurd, right? So what's going on here? Okay, so to start out, on the very first page of Singer's article, he gives us what he's going to be arguing from right off the start, right? So he says, the conclusion he's going to be arguing for is that we should extend to other species the most basic principle of equality that most of us recognize should be extended to all members of our own species. So here he's saying that generally people agree that all humans should be thought of as equals, right? This is not an uncommon moral idea, right? It's one that certainly meets our moral sensibilities, and we find it all over the place. And it's enshrined in some of the founding documents of the United States. Well, once it was amended, it had some not so equal clauses when it first got started, but eventually it did get there. And through what we consider to be the moral progress of the 20th century and into the 21st century, we've seen more and more people be granted equal rights. So this is at least an idea, right? At least the second part here, that we should recognize, extended to all members of our own species, that humans should be treated equally. And what he's suggesting here is not only does it apply to all humans, but it applies to other species too, right? Besides the species Homo sapiens. So what could possibly justify this kind of argument? Well, here are the premises that he gives us, and it's not enough just to give premises, we have to argue for them, but what are the things that he's going to need to convince us of in order for us to get to that conclusion? Well, the first one, what he's going to want to establish is by what criteria or criterion do we grant equality to all human beings, right? On what basis do we say that all humans should be granted equality, right? Then he's going to ask, well, do animals also meet this criteria? And it seems to follow from that if they do, we must also grant equality to all animals too. Okay, that seems like a reasonable, logical argument, but of course he's going to have to defend those, right? It might be logical, but is it true, right? Because we know that something can be highly logical and completely false, right? So what reason does Singer give us to think that these premises are true? Well, first, Singer unpacks what do we mean by equality, right? What kind of equality do we think should be granted to all humans? He first entertains a kind of factual equality, right? This would be, the argument would kind of go, we grant equality to all humans because all humans are factually equal. Well, the problem with maintaining this kind of argument is that it seems very clear that humans are not factually equal, right? We come in all different kind of shapes, sizes, sexes, and all kinds of things that make us unique individuals. And so, again, very quickly, it seems like we are quite different, and yet we still think that, we should be treated equal. Okay? Well, his second thing that he considers is average factual equality, right? So this is the idea that, sure, individual humans differ, but generally, taken as an average, humans, men and women, on average, have the same kind of abilities. People of different races have the same kind of abilities. On average, your average human being is going to have the same kinds of properties, and that's why we give them equality. Well, he finds some problems with this argument pretty quickly, right? The first major problem is that we are kind of this is no longer right, we are still in this premise can be tested factually, right? Theoretically, we could go out into the world and we could say, okay, let's go study the capabilities of different humans. Do they actually have the same kinds of capacities, right? And we think that they might, right? But what if it turns out that they don't? Well, this would be a huge problem. What if it turns out, and I believe I say this in my other demo reading this paper, right? What if it turns out tomorrow that all women do in fact have larger brains than men, and they are empirically more intelligent, more rational than all men? Would it be okay? Would we be okay with the idea that if we found this out tomorrow, that we therefore can treat men worse, right? And again, you can mess with this example to kind of test your intuitions on this, right? What if we found out, tomorrow that some people from a specific country somewhere on Earth are just, on average, factually better at everything than the rest of us, right? Would we think that should be treated worse then because of that? Well, generally, people's intuitions say, well, no, right? And why is that? Well, that could be a number of reasons. But Singer's point here is to point out, we all find that pretty problematic. He then considers this final one, right? Prescriptive equality, right? This is the idea that it's not based on any actual factual thing. We could go out into the world and test about the capacities of human beings. Rather, we are recognizing as a moral ideal that humans ought to be treated as equals, right? Or at least have their interests taken into equal consideration, right? This doesn't mean, right, that we have to treat all people the exact same way. That doesn't mean that I have to treat my mom like I would treat my brother, or that I would treat my brother like I would treat a stranger, right? No, that's not what he's arguing. What he's saying here is that what it means to treat my brother morally, I have to take that into account just as I take into account what it means to treat a stranger morally, right? He also uses an example from feminist philosophy here, right? He says to treat men and women as equals, right, might involve the idea that women have the right to an abortion, okay? And we're not going to legislate the morality of that, but would it therefore then make sense to say that men also have a right to an abortion? Well, no, because men, or at least, people who cannot give birth, cannot have abortions. So it doesn't make sense to give one kind of treatment, right? It's not a treatment we're talking about. We're talking about interests, right? Ways in which things can go better and worse for people. We have to take that into account, right? And he's going to deploy a pretty similar argument, actually, to animals as well. And why? And he throughout his paper, he's using an analogy of racism and sexism, right? And why does he do that? Well, these are also liberation movements, right? Movements where people who were not treated as equals have come to gain and fight for the right for that group to be treated as equals, right? We have come to see them as equals, and justifiably so, right? Well, the reason why Singer uses these historical liberation examples is because every time some group calls for the liberation of that group, we almost always find a general kind of mockery of that idea in typical society. We find it absolutely absurd that this other group could possibly be considered equal. And time again, we seem to be proven wrong about that, right? So why is that? Why are all humans equal? And remember, when I'm saying equality for the rest of this, I'm talking about prescriptive moral equality, or otherwise known the equal consideration of interests. Ways in which we have to consider ways in which those lives can go better or worse for the people who are living them, right? What does it make sense to talk about in terms of rights for that kind of creature, okay? So basically, the kind of argument that Singer is making here is an argument from consistency, right? He's going to say, if we want to treat all humans equally, right? We want that conclusion, and we think that's the right conclusion. Then we're going to have to identify what allows us to make that conclusion. And again, if we want to be consistent, if we want to maintain that conclusion, if we don't want that conclusion undermined, then we're also going to have to apply it consistently to animals if it does turn out that animals also meet that criteria. Let's see. Prescriptive equality, right? So this isn't something that he's made up, right? This is something that's found in almost every single moral theory, right? In Kantian ethics, everyone's morality should be exactly the same, right? Because it's based on these universal principles of reason. In utilitarianism, we know that this is a aggregationist, impartial theory. So the happiness of one person does not count any more than the happiness of another person, right? Their units of happiness count the exact same, right? And generally, we understand this to be a basic moral ideal that makes sense to us, right? But why do we think this, right? Why is this such a ubiquitous feature in moral reasoning? On what basis can we assert that all humans deserve moral equality? Well, Singer is right off the bat, right? And he's going to consider some objections later, but he says it is the capacity for suffering and or enjoyment of happiness, right? He calls this sentience for shorthand, which is not, he acknowledges not technically true, like the correct definition of sentience, but that's what he's going to say, and probably what I'm going to say for convenience, right? So why sentience, right? Why the capacity for suffering and or enjoyment of happiness? Well, Singer thinks that this property is something that things with interests have because it is the thing that gives them interests in the first place, right? Why not extend the principle of equality even further, you might ask Singer? Why not think that all rocks are equal, right? Why not think that my interests count as much as a bacteria's interests, right? Well, he's going to say, well, that would be dumb because a rock does not have interests. A rock does not care if you kick it down the road or if you put it in a cradle, right, and walk it down the road. It does not care if you break it in half. It does not care if you throw it off a cliff, right? Things that can suffer really do care about those kinds of things, right? So the ability for things to go worse and for that thing to care about things going worse, right, is this criterion that Singer wants to apply as the reason why all humans deserve moral equality. Okay? And then we'll get to objections in a second. So, sentience. Is all sentience created equal? Well, probably not. And how do we know this? Well, we know this because of the hedonistic calculus, right? Utilitarians are these freaks love talking about pain and pleasure in all of its minute detail, right? They will talk about the intensity, propinquity, fecundity, the certainty of pleasure. And so we know that just because something can be happy doesn't mean that it's going to have the same intensity or certainty of happiness, right? So we can analyze exactly what this means. Now, and this might be a potential response to Singer that I don't know, he does not consider it in this paper. He does later on in his work. But, the sentience of a dog may not be the same as the sentience of a human being. Now, why is that? Well, humans are able to kind of cognize their interpretations of the world, right? We're self-conscious. We recognize and we can premeditate, right? We can worry about an exam coming up 2 weeks down the future, and we can worry about how that is going to affect our interests. And that might mean like the intensity or the duration of our capacity to suffer or capacity to experience enjoyment is actually greater, right? But that does not undermine his main point here, which is the idea that all sentience matters. Doesn't matter what quantity of it, right? If it exists, we have to take it into our considerations certainly if we're on board with some of the utilitarian thinking, certainly as utilitarian, but even morally speaking generally, this is something like, and he's going to say that basically for all moral theories this applies. This is the thing that we care about when we do ethics, right? So all sentience matters. All right. So that raises the question: why do we care about sentience in humans but not in animals, right? Well, first he establishes, well, I think you could probably go into a little bit more depth in this, but it does get kind of gruesome when you start to think about it, right? Do animals actually have sentience, right? Can they feel enjoyment? Can they suffer? Well, it seems pretty obvious to us that yeah, they can, right? It's the reason why we care about how animals are treated, right? For some people, they care more about how animals are treated than human beings, right? I don't know if you're ever watching a movie and something horrible is happening to the main character, but if they hurt that main character's dog, oh, it's over, right? This is something different entirely. Okay, so why do we care about sentience in humans but not in animals if both kinds of creatures, right? If these both different species have it, right? Well, is this a difference in moral equality, right? Well, no, right? Because both creatures have it, right? If we are saying that all humans have to have equal consideration because of sentience, then all animals also meet that same criteria. So that can't be it. What about necessity, right? What if it is a fact that in order for humans to continue living, that we must treat animals in the way we do? And Singer has particularly in mind, he has the meat industry and he has experimentation on animals, vivisection, and other kinds of treatment of animals, right? Do we have to eat animals to live? No, we do not, right? This is, in Singer's time, he was writing this in the 1970s, this was true, right? He kind of talks about some food that doesn't sound great. He talks mostly about tofu and other soy products, but it's especially not true now. There are tremendous amounts of options that provide protein and a complete nutritional complement for humans who do not consume animal flesh. Okay, so it's not out of necessity. We don't have to do that. So what is it, right? Singer's going to say, well, it actually comes down to just prejudice, right? It just comes down to speciesist bias. Just as, right, why did, in the United States, did white people treat black people poorly? It was because of prejudice. It was because of racist prejudice, right? Treating someone poorly based on their race and for no good reason, right? Same with a sexist analogy here, right? Why it would be sexist, right, based on poor reasoning to think that women and men should not be given equal consideration because we know so much about their capacities and we can assert so much about their equality. It would seem to argue against that would be an unjustified kind of bias. So Singer's kind of calling us out here, right? He's saying that we may not realize it. This might be a moral blind spot for us, and that's not necessarily our faults, right? It's the culture that we live in. But the culture that we live in is highly prejudiced against other kinds of species, okay? So what do we think about that? Well, let's return to this overall argument, right? This is the exact same argument that I put up on the screen earlier, right? By what criteria do we grant equality to all humans? Well, we grant moral equality to all humans because all humans are sentient. Do animals also meet this criteria? Many animals do seem to demonstrate sentience, right? Some don't, right? Some are pretty blurry, like insects. Basically anything that doesn't have a vertebra, it's a lot less clear if they have the same kind of sentience that humans and other mammals, as well as other vertebrates have. And this is also why, we don't really need to care about rocks or bacteria that much, is because they don't seem to demonstrate sentience, right? And, right, he said up at the very beginning, if he can prove these things, then it seems like we must grant more equality, right, moral equality, an equal consideration of interests to all sentient animals, all right? So what are the repercussions of this argument? Okay, sure, Singer, so what, right? Well, if that's his conclusion, it seems like, since we would find it monstrous to use humans as sources of meat or unwilling participants in medical experiments, then we shouldn't treat animals that way either, right? It gets a little bit more nebulous when we start to talk about specific treatment, right? What is the best kind of life for an animal, right? What is the peak kind of animal enjoyment is less clear. But it does seem pretty clear that being meat or being unwilling participants in medical experiments are not in their best interests, and we would never even think about treating other sentient human beings in that way, right? So this is a direct kind of call to action, right? So Singer then considers several objections to his argument, right? What if, right? So the thing he's considering objections to is this first one, right? Maybe it's not sentience, right? If we can point to some other criteria or criterion about what gives us the basis to prescribe moral equality to all human beings, then maybe we don't need to accept this argument, okay? So what about the idea that they are human, right? The mere fact that an animal is not a human, why is that not good enough to justify our different treatment of them? Singer has a pretty devastating line to this effect, and let me actually find it in the document, right? Okay, so let's see. He says right here on page 5, or at the end of page 4 and page 5, right? Let's see. If a being is not capable of suffering or of experiencing enjoyment or happiness, then there is nothing to be taken into account. This is why the limit of sentience, using the term as a convenient, if not strictly accurate, shorthand for the capacity to suffer or experience enjoyment or happiness, is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. To mark this boundary by some characteristic, like intelligence or rationality, would be to mark it in an arbitrary way. Why not choose some other characteristic like skin color, right? So he's basically saying, why is human form not a good reason to treat animals differently? Well, it's to mark the line of moral consideration in an arbitrary place. Why not mark it somewhere differently, like the skin color of people, or where they were born, or what their bodies look like, right? He's saying here that our criterion must speak directly to the thing that provides moral interest in the first place, right? I hope that's making sense there. The human form seems to be arbitrary, right? It seems like that's not why we care about giving people moral consideration, right? What about human dignity, right? Well, he has some lines about this too, right? Why not? Because humans are the kinds of creatures that are granted dignity just because they are humans, right? Is there some kind of special quality, right? And so he says this on page 8. He says, the truth is that the appeal to the intrinsic dignity of human beings appears to solve the egalitarian's problems, right? Someone who wants an equal society, only as long as it goes unchallenged. Once we ask why it should be that all humans, including infants, people with significant intellectual impairments, psychopaths, Hitler, Stalin, and the rest have some dignity or worth that no elephant, pig, or chimpanzee can ever achieve, we see that this question is as difficult to answer as our original request for some relevant fact that justifies the inequality of humans and other animals, right? In fact, these two questions are really one. Talk of intrinsic dignity or moral worth only takes the problem back one step, because any satisfactory defense of the claim, that all and only humans have intrinsic dignity would need to refer to some relevant capacities or characteristics that all and only humans possess, right? Philosophers frequently introduce ideas of dignity, respect, and worth at the point which other reasons appear to be lacking, but this is hardly good enough. Fine phrases are the last resource of those who have run out of arguments. Pretty brutal, right? Like, as far as philosopher goes, that is like really sassy, right? And that's why reading Singer is always so enjoyable. He's consistently very sassy in his philosophical writing, and so what he's kind of appealing to here, right, is I guess I'm skipping a bullet point here, but the overlap problem, right? It seems that you can point to no characteristic that only humans have and that all humans have, besides maybe human form, but we've already discussed that's arbitrary, right? That all humans have that animals don't, right? When it comes to rationality, right, he talks about children or people with serious intellectual impairments. He says that there are animals that are far more rational than children or people or some people with serious intellectual impairments. And so and he can do this for all kinds of different potential characteristics, right? The problem, right, the challenge to the person who wants to reject his argument is to find something, some characteristic that doesn't suffer from this overlap problem, right? He also talks about this appeal to personal incredulity, right? This is where he's really sassy to some other philosophers, right, and where they're arguing. Some philosophers say it is simply absurd to consider that we ought not, or that we ought to grant animals the same kind of moral consideration that we do for other humans. The problem with this is, well, first of all, this is the exact same argument deployed to deny people of color and women equal rights, and it's also just flat out a logical fallacy, right? It's called an appeal to personal incredulity, right? Just because I can't believe it doesn't mean that's not true, right? Things could be true, and we're also not wanting, willing, or able to comprehend it, right? So these are the various objections that he considers. Where does this leave us? Well, one of the reasons why I talk about this paper is for a number of reasons. The first is that I think it's a really excellent example of what a philosophical argument looks like in this more extended form, right? We haven't necessarily covered those so much in this class, and so I do want to get you some exposure to it. I think the other problem, or the other reason why I like to teach this paper is because it's a challenge to us directly. How much did we really mean it when we said we are open to different viewpoints, that we are open to being convinced by the truth and not by rhetoric, right? What are we to do when we're given an argument that seems to call us out for what we do every single day, right? And these are questions that I don't think have obvious answers, right? I'm not telling you that you have to respond to this argument in any particular way. What I am telling you is that you have to choose to respond to it somehow, right? And even choosing not to respond to it is still to make a choice, right? So I'm going to leave you with that, and I'm happy to discuss this paper further and other arguments about animal ethics. It's one of the things that got me interested in philosophy in the first place with you, but I'm going to leave it off there because I'm really interested to see what y'all have to say for your discussion post, which is asking you, right, how do we respond to this kind of argument? What are some other ways that we can choose to attack this argument? What are some things that maybe Singer hasn't considered? And ultimately, what if this argument succeeds? What does that mean we should do, right? These are non-obvious questions, and these are questions, but also questions that I think you should take seriously. So, really excited to see what you have to say about it. Please do let me know if you have questions.